Well, my name is Lisa Igram. I'm one of the staff members in spiritual development, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I have a question for you. I'm wondering, out of all of the workshops that you could have attended today, all the different people who are presenting, what is it about this one that made you think, yeah, I want to learn more about life with God at church? Is it because this is something, the church is something you're passionate about? Is it because you're struggling right now in your church experience? Is it because you wanted to get credit and you didn't know where else to go? And this is the most comfortable place to be, I think. Talk to your neighbor. Just let your neighbor know, this is why I wanted to be here today. All right. So I'd love to know if I could hear maybe from 2 or 3 of you, what is it that drew you here today? If you wouldn't mind raising your hand, someone who has a little more bravery. Yeah. You, me. That's so kind of you. Thank you. What else? What is another reason why you came here today? Did I hear someone say something? No? Yeah. It's hard to have a meaningful experience in a lot of church settings. How many of you find that to be the case for you? Yeah, I think that's pretty normal. Good. One other person. It takes a brave soul, I know, to raise your hand and suggest something. We're going to be doing a little bit of interacting throughout this workshop, so I would like to invite you to speak up if you want to. But I'm going to start telling you just a little bit about myself to understand how kind of this workshop came about. I grew up in a Christian school, Christian home, the kind of home where my parents had me go to church every Sunday. And so I wouldn't say that there was a certain point where I became a Christian. I think that I've always known who God is and wanted to follow him. But I would say that probably the more consistent times of feeling alive in my faith with God started more of when I was in college. I grew up here in Orange County, but I went to school in Western Pennsylvania. Anyone from Pennsylvania? Grove City College. Oh, yeah. Cranberry Township. Awesome. Grove City College is right in the middle of farm country, right in the middle of Amish country. And all students who went to Grove City had to live on campus all 4 years or 5 years, and freshmen couldn't have cars. Now, it was a really small town, and so Sunday mornings, when it was time for church, we would see lines of cars driving through the main street through campus, picking students up to drive out to the various churches in the area, and we'd see long streams of students filling the sidewalks to walk to one of the 3 churches that were within walking distance of my school. And I was one of the people who joined the streams of walkers to a church called Main Street Presbyterian. I grew up Lutheran, so it was kind of a different experience. But that's kind of where all the people who didn't really have cars went. When I was a junior, I had a car on campus, and I went to the church that was kind of known as the one where the serious Christians went, because they had 45-minute exegetical, expository sermons, and the word was coming alive to me. And so that was kind of like, that was important to me my junior and senior year. That was something that God was doing in my heart. But I did notice that through college, and then when I graduated from college, came back here to Orange County, I struggled a lot with church. I struggled to engage. So I kind of want to go through a little bit about what my story is, but I don't want this workshop to be about why you should go to church. If you need to know why you should go to church, go talk to Dr. Klink or Dr. Tonnes. They have lots of great reasons that are all true. And I don't want this to be a session where we're thinking about how the church can do things differently. That's not what this is either. This is going to be a little bit more about what God is doing in my heart when I walk into a church on Sunday morning or maybe Saturday night or whenever it is that you prefer to go. What is it that God is doing in my heart? And how can I engage with that? And how can I also maybe see what God is doing in the lives of the people who are there? So my hope is to prompt some reflection and questions for you kind of towards that end. But I also kind of want to get a survey. I want to kind of see who I'm talking to here, if that's okay. And as I ask these questions, I want you to know that I know it's hard to get to church. In fact, I read a study that says that 40% of freshmen, if you struggle to get to church, and if you're a freshman and within the first month you're not at a church, then it's probably not very likely that you'll be a regular attender throughout your college experience. That's just how it is. So as I ask these questions, I don't want them to raise any kind of guilt or shame for you. I just kind of want to know what's going on. So what I would like to know is, how many of you are attending a church that you were attending before you actually came to Biola? Raise your hand. Okay, so some of you have grown up in a church that you're still kind of going to. How many of you are attending a church that is new to you since coming to Biola? Okay, so that's a little bit more of you. How many of you would say you go to something like a mega church, like Rock Harbor, maybe Sarong Community Church? Raise your hand. Mega church. How many of you go to a large church, so maybe like Whittier Area Christian Community, or I don't know, what's up the street, EV Free, Grace EV Free Fullerton, a large church? And how many of you go to a small church, like 200 members, little church on the corner? That's kind of the church that I grew up in, but I've also been to other different kinds of churches as well. You'll notice there's a great deal of diversity even in this room. There really wasn't a huge difference between the type of churches you're going to in terms of numbers. But it's interesting because even though there's great diversity in the types of churches you're going to, a lot of times you have a similar experience at church. So do me a favor and close your eyes. And I'd like you to imagine that this is the last time you sat in church. Maybe it was a week ago, maybe it was a month ago. Imagine the sight. What were you seeing in that church? What were the smells like in that church? Can you recall what thoughts you were thinking as you came in and sat down? Were you thinking about your to-do list? Were you wondering if the guy or girl you like was going to be there? Or maybe you were thinking about a conversation you just had. What feelings did you have as you came in and sat down? Did you want to be there? Were you apathetic about being there, just kind of attending out of obedience? Were you tired? Were you kind of uncertain? Maybe there was some confusion. Maybe you were really joyful there. Maybe you were distracted. As we sit in church on Saturday night or Sunday morning, we all have something in common. We've come to that place with a full week's worth or longer of life and experiences. And we all know we're here because this is part of what we do as Christians. The author of Hebrew tells us to not give up gathering together in Christ. And although we have this in common, sometimes we have very different stories to tell about our experiences and encounter with God that morning. Go ahead and open your eyes. I know that when I leave my church on Sunday morning and I kind of listen to what's happening over the coffee, donut, red punch time that people are having together, I'll hear everything from, gosh, that was such a great sermon, to, I wonder if the pastor kind of took this thing out of context, to, I was so distracted during the sermon, I don't know if you put the preparation into it that maybe should have been in the sermon this morning. Or I might hear about the worship. Gosh, the worship was so good this morning. Or, the guitar player broke his string and he was a little bit off key. He should have maybe chosen this song instead of that song. Or sometimes I'll hear, most of the songs I did not like, but I loved that song, and that song we should sing every Sunday in church because that's the best one. Or maybe I'll hear, gosh, communion was really such a special time for me this morning. I felt like I was sitting in the love of God. Or I might hear somebody say, communion didn't really mean anything for me this morning. I was just thinking about how hungry I was and I was excited to go to breakfast. Sometimes we have very different experiences of the exact same thing. And so the question is why? Why is that happening? Well, I'm going to talk through two things that I think are going on. First, I think some of it has to do with your spiritual personality, so to speak. The unique ways in which God created you to be and to engage with him. And I think some of it also has to do with God inviting you into a place of your heart that he's wanting to transform, and that he's wanting to work on. So we're going to start with our spiritual personality. And with that, I'm going to offer a confession to you. For most of my high school and college experience, I felt really guilty about something. I felt guilty and a lot of shame over the fact that I am an introvert. I am a huge introvert. I recharge by being alone. I like having conversations with small groups of people, not with large groups of people. I'm pretty quiet. I'm not terribly outgoing. And this isn't to say that I don't love people, because I do. I really enjoy having conversations, one-on-one, in small groups. But while some of my best friends are energized by being around 20 of their best, closest friends in kind of a wild and crazy environment, that's not very helpful for me. I feel more connected when I'm one-on-one or when I'm with a small group of people. And somehow, I think when I was in college and high school, I got the idea that the ideal Christian is somebody who is outgoing, extroverted, is everybody's friend, is involved in everything at church, is involved in everything on campus. And I felt really guilty that I wasn't energized in those same ways. And I can tell you, by the end of my college experience of trying to live as an extroverted person, I was exhausted, completely exhausted. But I have to tell you that this part of my personality highly affects the kind of church that I have chosen to attend. The church that I go to now is small. It's a little church plant of like 100 people. And a high value for that church that I attend is silence. They set aside 10 to 15 minutes before the service even begins for people to come in and just sit and reflect. I love that part of the service. Honestly, the sermons don't mean much to me right now. The worship, it's fine. My favorite part of the service is actually communion, because it's a chance to be a little bit quiet, to reflect. My least favorite part of the service is the greeting time, when I have to turn to the person next to me that I don't know and say hello to them. But I do it out of obedience. Here at Biola, we have several different kinds of chapel opportunities for you to attend, and I think some of them have different personalities as well. So Singspiration, what's its personality? Extroverted, it's loud, it's like this huge dynamic venue. Everyone's best friends get together, and when you're there, you can maybe feel like you're part of the community in a way, or at least you're longing for that. Fives, what's Fives like? It's a little more introverted, right? Fosters reflection. It also tends to be the same every week, right? The same 5 movements every single week. For some of you, that's exactly what you need. That's the way you engage with God, knowing what's going to happen. For some of you, something more dynamic is important, kind of the charismatic, we don't know what the Spirit's going to do. That really is fitting for you. What about Talbot chapels? They tend to kind of be more traditional. Some people might call them more intelligent or academic. And for those of you who feel connected to God, when you are exegeting a Greek language and an understanding of that word brings a whole new insight into some deep truth or doctrine of God, that's where you feel connected. And so you might be drawn to more of the Talbot chapels, or you might be drawn to morning chapels where we work with scholars that are experts in their discipline. For some of you, you feel most connected to God when you have a chance to listen to and pray for another person. When you have a chance to love another person in that way, that is when you feel alive. One of my good friends once told me that's when she feels most alive, in the parts of the church services before and after when she gets to pray for someone. And that's so cool. All of these things are different. None of them are right or wrong. These preferences, these ways that God created you to be, they're different. They're not right or wrong. There are differences among us in this very community, in this very, among the 400 of us who are here, that reflect the different ways that God made us and that make us appreciate certain flavors of spirituality over others. No one church service can fit your spiritual personality. Church services are created for the diversity of God's people. But what I'd like to know is, for you, what part of your church service do you most connect with? Maybe it's not every week, but maybe on a more consistent basis. What is the part of the service that right now seems to speak to you a little bit more than the other parts? I'd like you to go ahead and, if you're an introvert, you're welcome to just sit there and think on your own. And if you're an extrovert, feel free to talk to your neighbor. Just take about 5 minutes to consider, Lord, what part of your church service do you most connect with? And how does this part of the service help you to engage with God? So I'll give you about 5 minutes. For some of you, that's going to be the best part of this workshop, because you learn something new about yourself and about God. I would love to hear, though, if anybody wants to say, what is the part of your church service that most connects with you? Feel free to shout it out or raise your hand, whatever. Communion. Okay. Someone else. Praying for people. Love it. Who else? Worship. How about one more? Listening to the sermon. Gosh, 4 different things right there. If you all went to the same church, you'd hear something very different. You'd receive something very different from the Lord. It's so cool. There tends to be, in addition to kind of our spiritual personality, there tends to be something else that also might be going on for you. I mentioned that in my church right now, I feel like, yeah, the worship's okay, and the sermons, honestly, it's hard for me to pay attention. But really, that says far more about what God is doing in my heart than that is a commentary on what the worship really was like or what the sermon really was like. It's an important thing to consider. That developmentally, things change. God is working in our hearts in different ways. He's transforming us in different ways. And that might affect the parts of the service that we're connecting with, and it might affect kind of the negative frustrations that we feel in a typical church service. Another example here from Biola's campus. I'm kind of nerdy because I like statistics, and I think it's interesting to see what chapels you guys are going to. So I'm going to give you some statistics and see what, and I have some theories about why this is true, but I'm open to they're open to interpretation. We don't really know. So Singspiration. Did you know that almost half of Singspiration is freshmen? Isn't that interesting? And I think this might be because Singspiration is a little bit like the place to be on Biola's campus when you first get here, right? That's where you know everybody is. I know from my own college experience, my freshman year, so I mentioned I grew up in a Christian school, Christian family. Gonna say it was a little bit lukewarm, especially my Christian high school. And so when I got to Grove City and I saw a bunch of people my age, 2,500 students, with a desire to passionately worship God, whoa, this blew my mind. My favorite part of our chapels when I went to Grove City was the 20 to 30 minutes before chapel even started, when students would gather into the sanctuary and worship. That was my favorite part. The Lord was teaching me what passionate worship of Him looked like. It's so cool. Now, what about fives? Which class do you think kind of dominates fives? Guesses? Juniors and seniors, sophomores? It's actually sophomores. But I'm going to say sophomores and juniors. So like sophomores and juniors, like 30% each about, are in fives. And my theory, again, afterwards, feel free to tell me if you think differently. My theory is that when you get to be a sophomore, some of the glory of being at Biola has kind of faded. And for some of you, maybe you thought you'd come to Biola and you could kind of reinterpret yourself, reinvent yourself a little bit. And by sophomore year, you might be finding that all the stuff you thought you wanted to leave behind is actually still there. So maybe there's some confusion. Maybe there's some desire for confession. Maybe a deeper desire to connect with God in a more authentic way that's more like you. And so I think fives can provide the space for that. And then we get to Sabbathing. Who do you think dominates Sabbathing by far? Actually, it's juniors, but seniors, do you know what seniors do? A lot of makeups. It's great. It has to happen sometimes, you know? But juniors tend to dominate Sabbathing. And I think that's because, and if it's reflective of my own college experience, junior year, you're just busy. When I was a junior, I had 3 jobs. I was involved in 2 organizations on campus, and I had declared a double major. You're busy, right? You need space. And so 2 hours of alone time, especially if you're an introvert, and 3 chapel credits, holy mackerel, this is awesome, right? This is kind of reflective and indicative of the things that God does in our lives over time, developmentally. For myself, when I was a freshman and sophomore, I loved the praise and worship on my campus. That's where God was meeting me. By the time I was a junior and senior, I switched churches because I loved those 45-minute exegetical sermons. And in that, God was teaching me a passionate love for his word and how his word can transform and shape my heart. It changed. But all of this changed kind of my dynamic experience of the Lord when I graduated and when I left Grove City. And I came back here to Southern California. Right after college, I spent 2 years overseas in China teaching English. And so I was with a team of people who were really together fostering dependence on God to do the things he was calling us to do there. And so after 4 years of being around some pretty passionate people in college, 2 years of being around some people who were fostering dependence on God, and coming back to my home church, the church I grew up in, it felt really dry. I would tell people for most of my 20s, I would tell people, church isn't really where I'm learning a lot about God. I learn a lot about God at this Bible study that's separate from my church. And my community, where I feel connected, is actually with this group of friends that I fostered from work and who had also returned back from the mission field with me. And my church was where I served. That's what church was for me. It's where I served. It's where I was on the church council, where I co-led a women's Bible study, where I helped lead worship, where I gathered a group of people to go on a mission trip overseas. That's kind of what church was for me. And honestly, within that time, I would think, gosh, the pastor's sermons just really, they need to be more exegetical. Then I would get more out of them. And the worship is okay, but I miss my talented group of friends who were really passionate about singing to the Lord. And I just didn't feel that in my church. And honestly, because it was a small church, I was the only single person my age. And so there wasn't really anyone that I felt like I could connect with. And so with all this, I harbored quite a bit of pride, quite a bit of judgmentalism, maybe a little bit of resentment, because I felt like I had a Bible degree. I had gone overseas to teach English and do mission work. And I didn't see that passion that I wanted to see at my own church. And yet, over those years, as I stuck with my church, even through the judgmentalism and the pride in my own heart, the Lord used that to teach me something very important. I saw slowly some really cool, maybe from the outside look insignificant, but actually very significant things happen. I watched as in a family, the mother passed away, leaving behind a 2-year-old girl with a single dad, and how the women of the church came in and became like moms for this little girl. And I watched how one of my friends, her husband betrayed her and left her. She kind of had to rebuild her life again, and I got to help just be with her in that time. I watched how another woman who was a single mom of an older boy decided to actually start a mentoring ministry for young girls in the neighborhood. And I watched as this ministry grew for junior high and high school girls, grew from like 20 to over 100. And again, not just within the church, but people in the surrounding community. I watched as men in the church came together to keep the property clean when maybe we didn't have enough money to call people from the outside to put things together. I felt incredibly supported when my fiance called off our engagement 2 months before the wedding. And I knew I could go to that church and get a hug from these 2 women in particular who would love me but not give too much advice, because I didn't need advice during that time. I got to hear the stories of an older woman who had walked with Jesus her entire life, and with tears in her eyes tell me stories of how she knew that he was with her in a time where I really struggled to see where Jesus was for me at all. I think through this time where I was judging the sermon the worship, the passion of the people, God was opening my heart and teaching me that church wasn't about doing it right or wrong. It wasn't about a better worship team or a pastor who was a better communicator or better programming at the church. It was about process. God was using my little church to show me some of the most judgmental and prideful places in my heart, as well as the depths of his love for ordinary people living ordinary lives and seeking to love him as best they knew how. And it was beautiful. So church for me over the last 10 years hasn't been about insight. It's been about learning to live and love in a community of people who are as a whole seeking to live together their lives with God. For me, it's been learning that in spite of what I perceive to be failure from people in authority, that God works, is glorified, and is so very present with us. So I think showing up at church week after week, and inviting him into your process, and telling him the things that are hard, and telling him the things that are good. This is an invitation from you to God to say, God, what are you doing? What are you doing in my life? What are you doing in the lives of the people around me? Sometimes the hardest parts we can learn the most from. So what I'd like you to do, you don't have to talk to your neighbor about this, but I'd like you to consider what part of your church service can be more difficult for you to engage with, if any. Because maybe church is totally cool for you right now. But as you consider kind of the harder parts, what do you think God might be doing? What do you think he might be showing you about your heart? And I want to say this too, that you may not leave with the answer to this today, if this is something you're going to spend time reflecting on. It might take months or years to even see kind of the fruit of what God is doing in that hard part. But feel free to take a moment now and ask the Lord these two questions. Sometimes it's a sheer act of obedience to go to church, and sometimes it's really hard when life gets so busy. But if we, as we do obey this command, when we're able to not give up meeting together from Hebrews 10:25, there are some things that some strategies maybe that we can use to turn our hearts, so to speak, to the Lord and see what he might have for us. So I'm sure there are more strategies than this, but this is just kind of what I came up with. Maybe you have other ideas too. So regardless of how we come, no matter where your heart is, it might be good to simply ask the question, Lord, where are you at work today among us? Just ask the question. Ask the question before. Try to pay attention to the people around you, things that are happening as you go through the service. And then consider reflecting afterwards. Lord, what were you doing? Then look for the small things, like the cute little kids that sing in the choir and how excited they can sometimes get. Sometimes that can be the most encouraging thing, that childlike faith. Maybe it's just someone's prayer that gives you insight into the difficulties that other people are living that maybe you don't have any concept of. But it's good to ask this question, Lord, where are you at work? What are you doing? Another question, Lord, what are you teaching me during this time? Maybe it's the long haul of learning to stick to a commitment, even when it's not convenient. Maybe it's learning a different perspective from someone who's 5 or 10 years or 15 years older than you. Maybe it's seeing examples of faith from people who come from radically different socioeconomic backgrounds than you. Maybe it's gaining empathy for the doubts of other people or their inevitable choices. Maybe it's a chance to see that God is so much bigger than life, even here at Biola. It's a good question to ask. Lord, what are you teaching me in this time? From my own experience, I can say it's been important for me to find someone to connect with. As an introvert, I've done this by volunteering. If I volunteer for something, I know I'm going to meet somebody. If you're an extrovert, man, use that personality. Find someone, meet someone, try to find them again the following week. Over time, I came to realize the people that I could go to when I just needed a hug, or the people I could go to when I wanted conversation or just wanted to laugh. It takes time, but it's worth it. I would say if you're new to La Mirada, if you're a new student, it's worth exploring. It's worth seeing the different kind of churches that are out there. But don't explore too much. I would say by your second semester, choose a church and stick with it. Sometimes it's easy, like I did when I was in college, to switch churches because it just, wasn't quite what I wanted anymore. It's easy to do that. If I had done that with my church here back at home, I would have missed the fruit of seeing a loving community that I had been blind to before. So it's worth sticking with a commitment, sticking to a church, digging in, meeting somebody, talking to them week after week. God will have something for you in that. Turn to a partner, and maybe there's a strategy on the screen, or maybe there's something else that has come to your mind that the next time you go to church, you're going to try. So let them know what that is. Last semester, I wrote a paper. Oh, use that one, yeah. Oh, that's a good one. What would that do for you? It is awkward, isn't it? I will say though, and I've heard this from all the churches I've ever gone to, churches love it when college students are there. Because you guys do bring in a kind of passion that some people who are further along in their journey forgot about, or maybe in a dark time, and it's super encouraging. So even your staying will encourage somebody. So thank you. I'll leave room for one more strategy if you... Sit towards the front. And what does that do for you? Yeah. It's like your own self-discipline. I can't pull out my phone because people might look, It's good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. A worship team, you said? Welcome team. What great way to meet people. Yeah. Yeah, the welcome team, that's part of their job, to help you feel connected. It's a great idea. Anyone else? Great ideas. Thank you. So last semester, I wrote a paper on the development of what we might call the church's liturgy. And liturgy, broadly defined, is really just the standard elements and language of what we consider to make up a church service that the people of God engage in as a response to his love and a response to what he's done with us. So that's a broad definition of liturgy. Every church has one. It's the fabric of what makes up your church's engagement with God. And what I saw from the time of the upper room in Acts all the way to the present is that every church service, no matter how free-flowing or charismatic or traditional, has essentially the same basic liturgy. This liturgy that has been engaged in by Christians through the ages, and in fact is actually grounded in Jewish Sabbath practices. The medium, the method may have changed, the style of the service may have changed. It might be different from one service to the next. But regardless of the service, there is always reading of Scripture, commenting on it through a homily or a sermon. There's always some kind of musical or non-musical worship, some kind of affirmation of faith, confession, often communion. There's usually a greeting or community time, whether during the service, before or after, and there's always prayer. Every church you attend and ever will attend will likely have these components. Every church you ever attend will make mistakes and do things imperfectly. Every church you attend will be made up of sinners. It's partly why you're there too. But as you invite God into your process, as you walk into church on Sunday morning, he will use every church you attend to form your heart, to teach you something about yourself, to connect you with the larger body of Christ that has done this every week since the upper room. So stick with it. Enjoy the good parts of what church is for you. Talk honestly with God about the hard parts. I guarantee you that in your obedience, He will transform you. He will make you more like Him as you don't neglect meeting together, meeting with one another as Christ asked us to do.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.